My name is Terry Walter, and as you can see, I'm an AFTD ambassador. The ambassadorship program was started approximately 2 years ago, right before COVID started. So we got started and then stopped. And it was born out of a need to help make connections to the caregivers and medical community about FTD and to bring an awareness. I was not chosen, but decided to help with this because of my journey with FTD. And that's what my story is going to come next. It's not unique. And if you're a caregiver with FTD, you'll probably be hearing some of the same things that I will be saying. My journey started, my story started really back in 1981 when my husband's mother was diagnosed with ALS. And at the time, and you will see how I will interconnect the FTD and ALS together, we were told it's not genetic, it's not familiar. Well, that's, another story. And so we dealt with it, just her disease. But then about 4 years later, her sister started with the same symptoms and ended up with ALS. My sister and I, Law and I, we became really concerned about the family and tried to contact doctors, different places, with no avail. They really was not thinking that ALS was maybe familiar. It was in 1996 that probably my journey really got started with FTD. At that time, Stephen's oldest brother came out for my oldest daughter's high school graduation. And when they left, my sister-in-law said, "Did you notice something different about Phil?" And I said, "Oh, I was so busy with hosting dinners and graduation. I just didn't have time to sit down and talk with him." She goes, "Well, he could not initiate a conversation. He would only mimic what you said. If you said it was a nice day, it was a nice day. We're having fun, we're having fun." And so we just thought about it, and we thought about Mary and Peggy, Stephen's mother and aunt, and we go, what's going on? But we just had no idea. Progressively, Phil started getting worse, and it was in 1996 that Stephen, my late husband, was laid off from work after 25 years with the company. Supposedly they were downsizing and, changing their office in different companies. So you put that aside thinking, okay, that's okay. But that was really the last year he worked. And also by that time, Mike had quit working. So between 1996 and 2002, we did not have a diagnosis. Phil had been diagnosed as Alzheimer's finally, but Stephen and Mike, we could just see the writing on the wall. And so my sister-in-law at that point started doing research on the internet, and we came up with Pick's disease, which was another word for FTD. I am sorry. I thought I had everything turned off. Contacted the NIH. They were doing research on Pick's disease. And so she contacted them, gave us, a family history, and we were accepted into their program, into their research program, where they were just starting to research FTD. So it was in January of 2003, we went through a week of testing, and we got the diagnosis of frontotemporal degeneration, which we had never heard of. We had no idea. And at that time, they said they was thinking there was a connection between FTD and ALS. So for the next few years, of course, our lives were consumed. We had 3 brothers in 3 different stages of ALS, FTD. Phil, the oldest, Mike being the middle brother, and Stephen being the youngest. And so Phil passed away in 2004, Mike in 2006, and Stephen in 2007. All of them were in their late 50s or maybe 60, 61 at best, even with Mary and Peggy. So it's a young, and we would say their symptoms started in their late 40s with the FTD. So it was really after 2007, 2008 that we became very personally involved with the association, which the association had not started until late 2002, 2003. So we were just learning about them, they were learning about us. And so from that time, we've done a lot of volunteer work, a lot of fundraising, because most of FTD's finances or money comes from people like me, families who do fundraising and donate to FTD. We're still trying to make inroads for grants or government funding, but most of our finances come from grassroots fundraising. So that's what got me here today. I've been working with the association since 2007, 2008, but for about 25 years, I've been in the trenches working with somebody with FTD in some way. So that's just a little bit about my story. Families will tell you the same thing. It takes a long time to get a diagnosis, and much can happen to the family during that time. And so that's why our mission is, or my mission is, and my passion is to just get the awareness out there to so much of the community. So my objective today is to introduce you and to FTD, Frontotemporal Degeneration, which you probably know something about. It's why you signed up for this presentation. Review how it differs from Alzheimer's. And this is really a passion of mine, to make people aware of the differences. First thing, when I tell people my late husband passed away from dementia, they go, oh, his memory. And FTD can affect your memory, but it really is not memory, it's personality changes. And then summarize the different FTD subtypes and to highlight how much the association does help and support families and caregivers. We've come a long ways in the 20 years that we've been in existence. Dementia is just a general medical term for loss of cognitive function, severe enough that it interferes with day-to-day life, and most of us know that. The problems are listed here, and yes, it does have short or long-term memory, but that's just part of it. It's not their total problems. I would say sometimes the inappropriate behavior, the change in personality, physical movements, solving problems, reasoning, and you will see that most FTD people cannot hold a job. They lose it, and that was part of Stephen's. So from 1996, he was 46, I was 45 when he quit working, and so I became the sole supporter of the family. Each in my being involved with FTD, each person, and I think this is what makes it hard to diagnose, takes a different path. Even with the 5 family members, the problems were different. And some of the changes in personality were more in some and some less in others. The problem with thinking is just different. I mean, not that all these problems don't show up, but it is different for each patient. And even when I was helping with a support group, when I was speaking with the family members of their loved ones, each person seemed to have their own pathway. And I believe personally, just from talking with people, why it's different is because everyone's personality is different. And because this affects your personality so much, these are arranged in different orders to different degrees, just depending on who you are. And even with the 3 brothers at the same time going through FTD, they were all 3 different. One had more of the FTD symptoms. Mike was probably more FTD, where Stephen was really strong with ALS symptoms. That's really what seemed to be his thing. So even though they all had the same disease, it was different. And I just get back to that's why sometimes it is hard to diagnose, because it's not set 1, 2, 3, this is going to happen. You can have problems with behavior first or personality second. It's topsy-turvy for whatever reason there is. And I don't think even the medical community could give you a good reason. But for me, I've just come to believe that it's because of personality.
Terry, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but we did have a question that relates to what you were just talking about.
Okay.
Are hallucinations part of the symptoms for FTD?
You know, that I have not heard of much. Doesn't seem to be listed as a real common, but it could be. I don't have a good answer for that. I've never experienced it with, when you say, hallucinations. I've just, even in talking with the families from the support group and from the meet and greets that I've done, I have not heard of that being a problem.
Thank you.
I don't think that answers it well, but that's what I can give you. Now, if the individual really would like a question, they can, at the end, when we talk about resources, contact the AFTD Association, and they could probably help them with that.
Wonderful. I'll go ahead and keep track of questions as they come in on the chat.
Dementia is just an umbrella term for damage to the brain, and you can see that's listing Alzheimer's, Lewy body, frontotemporal degeneration, vascular dementia, and then mixed dementias. Alzheimer, of course, is the most common, then Lewy body, and then vascular, and then frontotemporal degeneration. But in the research that they're finding now, the mixed dementias are probably higher than what we once thought. The mixture of Alzheimer's, Lewy body, and vascular, those three, they have found many patients having all three symptoms in all three different pathways of these diseases in their brain. So they're finding that it's just not one disease, that it's a combination of it. And also the mixed dementia, ours is the FTD and the ALS. And so they call it now the frontotemporal spectrum disorder. And in 2011, they found a genetic gene that causes in FTD and ALS in the genetic family form. It's the same gene in both diseases. It's the C9ORF72, whatever that means. I am not a physicist or whatever, but it's that gene that they found causes both diseases. And I am proud to say, in a way, it's because of the Walter family that they found this gene. From the time that Michael and Stephen started in research, Phil was almost too far gone by then and didn't participate in that much. They were able to find this gene. Of course, at the end, we donated their brains for research, but they have found that this gene causes probably almost 40% of the ALS FTD spectrum disease. And for the good news is they are now have just started in the last few months, a couple of months, I was reading about where they're doing research, clinical research on how to stop this gene. And what happens is we all have it, and it maybe will repeat itself, say 10 times, but in a FTD and ALS patient, it keeps repeating and repeating and repeating itself. So they're looking now at different medications that can stop that the repeating of it. For me, I'm very happy because it is familiar. And so my daughters and granddaughters and nieces and nephews and their children are all at risk for this disease. I feel bad about just the regular random FTD. They're still getting very close to that, but they're really closer to the more familiar side. And at one time they thought FTD was a brain disorder, and ALS is a movement disorder. But with these mixed dementias, they're finding a mixture of it. And I think too, that's another reason why it's so hard to diagnose, because you can think it's one thing, but really it's a combination. And so that makes it very hard to treat also. This is really a passion of mine. What about FTD versus other dementias? It's most commonly under age 60, late 40s, early 50s is a very, very common age, but it has gone down. You could be in your 20s and 30s and 40s and end up with FTD. It's not as we think of with our grandparents, somebody 70 and 80 developing Alzheimer's. It's young. So it brings a whole set of different circumstances, different problems to a family. And once again, it's not primarily memory loss, but it's behavior, communication, movement changes. I have kind of nicknamed it, it's cancer of the soul, because it takes away who you are and what you are. It's very much more undiagnosed and is less common than Alzheimer's. Once again, I think it's not as rare as we once thought, because it's so misdiagnosed. Just the other day, I was at the hairdresser, and the individual kit that owns the shopping center, her name also is Terry. She goes, "Terry, did you know that Kit's wife was just diagnosed with FTD?" And I said, "No, I had not heard." And this is somebody who golfed with our golf tournament in 2008 and has been very supportive of us. And his wife got diagnosed with Alzheimer's. And for the last 2 or 3 years, my sister-in-law, because she knows them so much better and is personal friends with them, said, "Kit, you need to have her checked for FTD." Well, they finally did, and it's FTD and not Alzheimer's. The symptoms are different. They need to be managed different. And so that's really a passion of mine, is for people to know the difference. Alzheimer's is dementia, but not all dementia is Alzheimer's. And we do need to remember that. And another thing is there's more of a family history of a neurodegenerative disease that you find with FTD, whether it's someone that has just ALS, Parkinson's, there tends to be some family history. Of course, now we see that with cancer, it tends to run in families, heart disease, but it's there too. And to talk about the economic and social cost. As I said, I was 45 when Stephen quit working. That was about 25 years ago. I am now 71. And our oldest daughter was just taking off for college. I had another one in high school, and your income gets cut in half. And even today, I cannot imagine it happening today and having to go through that. But there's a big drop in your social cost, your economic cost. Say FTD versus ALS, the cost of keeping someone is roughly twice that, the burden. It could be the medical. I'm not sure where they got this figure from, but for me personally, you have kids in a lot of families. If it's in their 40s, they got young kids, 10, 12, preteen. So you're trying to raise a family. You're trying to deal with a patient, with a family member that has FTD, whether you can keep them at home or have to eventually put them in a facility. Stephen's 2 brothers went into the facility. I was able to keep Stephen at home just because of my insurance. And we had, in our early 40s, signed up for long-term care. So I had long-term care, and that really did help. But how many people today have long-term care, even if you can afford it? I think then when we signed up, it was $80 or $100 a month for the both of us for long-term care. I was just lucky in that Stephen was he said, you know, Terry, we might need this. So I said, okay, let's go ahead and do it. But it did, in the end, probably save me from losing my house and losing everything. For 10 years, I would go to bed at night thinking, you know, what would happen? What would I do with Stephen? Where would I put the girls if we lost the house? Somehow I always say, with the grace of God, I did make it. So there's a financial burden just because of the young. Just, you know, when your mother or father or whatever, grandparents get diagnosed with Alzheimer's, they're in their 70s, older, 80s. And yes, it is expensive, but they also don't have a large income. If you have to, you know, your income gets cut in half and you're raising your family. So it just brings different dynamics to the family. A lot of caregivers have to stop working because it is a full-time. Fortunately, I was able to continue working to keep my insurance, medical insurance, and my long-term care. Plus, I had a boss that was very, very patient with me. If I was late, left early, he never said anything and gave me flexibility so I could continue working. And in the beginning stages, when we're not sure what it is, your loved one does make, and you've probably seen this, poor financial decisions. I've talked to one individual before she caught on to what was going on. Her husband had spent over $1 million, had lost their retirement. One individual said his wife was buying $1,000 a month in lipstick. And they don't think they're doing anything. That's the I think, caveat with all this. If you talk to an FTD patient, say for 10, 15 minutes, they can hold it on their own. And you think, wow, there's nothing wrong with them. What's wrong with us for thinking these things? And so, you know, people don't really think about it. And you think, okay, maybe it's anxiety, depression, midlife crisis, why they're making these kind of decisions. But it's really behind is the FTD. I know for my youngest daughter, she was in high school when a lot of this really started with Stephen. And when you see your father doing weird things, you know, that don't make sense, or he's not working, she was embarrassed by it. And there was a lot of family issues going on because of that. Once we got the diagnosis, it was just so much easier because then we understood why he was doing what he was doing. And I'm sure that all those who are listening who are taking care of FTD patients you hear the same thing from so many. What happens where? You can see why it's called the frontal and the temporal. It hits the front of the brain and the side of the brain. And depending where it is the strongest too, and what part of variant it has, it can be a little different. It seems to just affect whatever is the person's strength seems to get affected the most. Apathy, I think, is one of the big things that we're finding with FTD. It does not have this listed, but apathy with a lot of them is really strong. They pull away. I think Stephen did, and so ourselves, our family became more isolated because I think he knew subconsciously, but he didn't know why. He couldn't keep up with conversation. That was really a hard time. He couldn't keep up with things. He couldn't think fast. Well, before, Stephen was highly intelligent, probably with an IQ of 130, 135 or so. And it frustrated him that he couldn't keep up. And so they withdraw from society. You become alone just with everything that is going on. Which adds another layer of stress to the family, to children. Children are so much more affected by FTD than with a lot of the other dementias, just because of the age of the person that has it. FTD is a complex, a cluster of different complex disorders. The progressive, which is just more the personality change. It's behavioral variant. I know more about that. The progressive, the language change type, I've not dealt with too much. I've talked to a couple of families with it, but it's whether your language, your speech, and then you do have some of the behavior issues, but not like in your behavioral variant. Probably what I'm most familiar with is the motor function movement. And at the bottom, you see motor plus the FTD plus the motor neuron is the ALS, but the cortical, basal, the CBS, and the PSP, they resemble very much Parkinson's symptoms. And so a lot of people are thrown into the category of Parkinson's disease when it's really part of the FTD movement category of disease. So they each have their own different but same type of symptoms. It's really, those who have gone through FTD know what I'm talking about. It's very hard to explain exactly, pinpoint what is going on because it's just, can be so subtle, but yet it's there. And that's why I think it gets just diagnosed as something else. And that's my next slide here. FTD is very difficult to diagnose. First of all, there's no single test. They keep trying. That was part of what they were doing when we were back at the NIH, back in Bethesda, is psychological type testing that they could give the patients to help them determine what path they're on. But because of the age, and I think when you have a 40-year-old man or woman, individual walking into a doctor's office, they do not think FTD. It is not comes to the top of the brain, where if you take your older parent in with some memory issues, Alzheimer's is there at the top of the tongue. But at 40, myself included, I thought it was depression, more so anxiety, midlife crisis, because Stephen was in mid-40s, late 40s, and laid off from a job he loved and had for 25 years. So we gave it to depression, and believe it or not, a lot of times FTD has been found because couples had gone to counseling for their marriage. And this is the personality change, the apathy that's there. So you think they're falling out of love with you. And so the neuropsychologists really seem to be up on this more than just a neurosurgeon or neurologist. But the neuropsychologist can seem to sometimes spot the problems and suggest further testing. They might not know what it is, but they will suggest something. So because the symptoms can be interpreted as other things, it really does make it hard. As same with Alzheimer's or with any form of dementia, it's not definitive without an autopsy. And that's when they're doing the autopsies, they're finding the mixed pathways more than they thought they would. And really, family input is so critical to try and decide what is going on. I know of a couple, his wife's father had the FTD and ALS, and they'd gone through that, and they had a couple of twin boys. And one day the boys came to the dad and they go, "Dad, Mom is starting to act like Grandpa." And he said, believe it or not, they were in marriage counseling. And so they then went and did more testing and came up with the FTD and ALS. But sometimes your children, and even my youngest daughter was probably more saying something's not right with Dad than my oldest daughter. But at 18, Stephen was just really probably getting started. she had left for college, so Christine was at home. She was a sophomore in high school. So she saw issues with her dad that I didn't see. I knew there was something different about him. And believe it or not, at one point I thought, do I want to end this relationship because of the differences? But the point came down to, I still loved him very much. And this wasn't the man I was married. Something had to be going on. But what happens with a lot of FTD family caregivers, we change. We change to accommodate them. Because, you know, if we say, well, you should know that, you should remember that, they don't. They think they do, and they have no ability to really reason and decide. So we change our approach to them. And I think that is one of the most critical things of living with an FTD patient, is to learn that you do have to adjust. You can't expect them to. And it's okay, you know, times I've had to lie to Stephen, and even with other families, they didn't always tell what was going on, because they don't understand, they can't reason. No matter, you know, you could do anything you want, and it just causes then friction, screaming matches. We've gone through all of that ourselves. And so then you learn to adjust. So family input is critical to evaluating what is going on with that person. It could be more than depression, bipolar, anxiety, what else is there. I said, there is now so much more hope with the current research and research participation. 20 years ago, when the association started, there was really no research going. And the Association for Frontotemporal Degeneration, AFTD, started by an individual. Her husband had had FTD and had passed away from it. And her frustration that no one was interested, there was no research, nothing going on. So just with a couple $100, she started an organization, her and another wife that husband had passed away, because they were told that they could not get any research probably until they had an association going. So the association now started with 2 individuals in 2002, 2003, just in that transition. And now back in Philadelphia, there's probably, I know they're just hiring right and left different individuals so they can expand what they can provide to families and patients. Maybe 20, 25 people now in the office. At one point in 2009, 2010, my sister-in-law was board of director. We did it from she did it from Sacramento, and it was back in Philadelphia, and went back and forth. And as she said, our whole budget, even for research and to run the office, was $350,000. And, you know, for that, that's a drop in the bucket. But I would say, unfortunately, a couple of very wealthy families have had this in their family, and now they have donated for research, and it has really made a difference. So as we said, now we have pharmaceutical companies coming and saying, can we participate? Can we get in on this research? And so there's quite a few now different research participation going on, that they think, you know, how close they are. So that is really, I think, the biggest hope for families. It gives me hope. My daughters are 43 and 40. So I do get into a panic because they're getting to the close when the Walter family started with symptoms with this, that they are doing more research. I also have hope that the one aunt that had the ALS, FTD, more the ALS, she had 3 boys and none of them have developed it. And, but yet we had 3 brothers from Mary develop it. So far, some of the nieces that are in their 50s, we don't have any signs. So, you know, first they said, if it's in your family, you're going to get it. Now they, you know, have backed off. It just depends. I still also have another theory that sometimes the environment does affect these diseases or can trigger it, but that's just my personal theory. They're now treating more the symptoms than when we were going through. They didn't even really treat the symptoms. If you had depression or other type of anxiety, they didn't give us anything for it. We just managed it somehow on our own. You have your supportive therapies like speech, physical, occupational. And it depends where your patient is, how receptive they are to it. I know for physical therapy, time I got in for that with Stephen, the physical therapist, and I don't want to talk against him because they do wonderful, but he declined to come back and help because Stephen couldn't participate. Well, the ALS was really progressing, and he just didn't understand. So in the beginning, these are really good therapies. In fact, I probably benefited from them more than Stephen did, because then I took what the physical therapist was doing, and every day at home I would work with Stephen on that, even though I did work. And of course, there's no treatment or nothing to stop or slow the disease. So that's really, I think, the more awareness we have too, and the more that people are diagnosed, I think that will even step up. We do partner with the Alzheimer's Drug Association in treatment. We do partner with a lot because of the overlap of all these diseases. But the bottom line is there is hope, especially for me. I feel with that gene that they're doing research and drug medication management on it, I am hopeful. So we'll see. In resources, these people back in Philadelphia are marvelous. Some of them have been with them for 20 years. And a lot of the workers back there are from families of FTD families. And it seems like once you've come across this disease, you have a passion because you see what it does. What it does to an individual, how it robs them of everything and robs the family. So their mission is research, awareness, support, education, and advocacy. And one of the big things for me, what they did when we started with this, when we applied for Social Security disability, mind you, this is almost 10 years after the fact when they really quit working, we were denied. But when they saw the ALS piece, then it was automatically approved. But now they have FTD on the list because of their work that they've done with those back in DC to have it. So when you come in with a FTD diagnosis, it's much, much easier to get the disability insurance. So they work very, very hard. I cannot say enough how wonderful they are. They also have a great set of network. Their website is great. You can go on, and if you're newly diagnosed, and where you can go and find partners in FTD care. The doctors think it's FTD, now what? And you can see we do a lot. What about the kids? And it has its own kids and teen website, because I cannot emphasize how important that is, because my sister-in-law, she had even 2 teenage boys at the time, how hard it is on the kids and how they are affected. And even now, I was talking to my one daughter, and she says sometimes she wakes up still in the middle of the night and worries what will happen to her kids. Because when they first found out about their father, they said, Mom, well, we'll probably, they knew one were married. We might get married, but we're not going to have kids. Well, now both of them have kids. And one of them has one that's 6, and the other one is 6 and 3. So Janine's 43, and she worries, what might happen to her kids. So it's a passion for me to keep working. And, with the grief afterwards, the loss, emotionally spent yourself for so long in trying to help your loved one. It really is a long, hard grief recovery, but you can. I finally made it. It's been 15 years since Stephen passed away, but sometimes it just seems like the other day. But that's maybe sometimes I think because I'm so involved with FTD, you know, and I can see why some people just walk away from it. You're done. You know, you've spent so many years and you've given it all. But the resources from AFTD, if you need help, they are there, and they're wonderful people. I'm hoping to learn more. Next week, I go back to Baltimore to their first, in a couple of years, their yearly conference on FTD. And they're going to be doing a lot about the research and the genetic part, and biomarkers, as you know, you have them for, say, heart disease, high blood pressure, this and that. They're trying to get people to participate so they can find biomarkers for FTD. It's part of the process of finding a cure. So how to get involved with FTD. It's like I am, you know, share the FTD information. I'm just a family member with a passion to find a cure for FTD, or even medication so you can live a well life with that. Participate in FTD research. As families, it is not easy. Probably from 2003, when we first was getting the diagnosis, until early 2006, we participated in a lot of research at the University of San Francisco, USFC, with Dr. Bruce Miller. And sometimes it seemed like once a week, I was going over to San Francisco, taking him there to participate in research. When he got more difficult with the ALS, I ended up purchasing a van so we could go. But now they have that gene, the C9orf72, and they're working on medications to control that gene, to stop it. So it does help, and it's not easy, but if you can participate in research, please do. And join the FTD registry. That's where they're looking for biomarkers, so they can spot people when they're in the early stages of it. And maybe then they can do more to slow it down and to help. Raise funds in support of the AFTD mission. They have different programs. You can look and see what suits you the best. Not everybody likes the same thing. So you just take a look, and then you come up with something of your own. They're very willing to help and support you. And join our volunteer network. We don't have chapters like the large diseases. I call them large: cancer, Alzheimer's, heart, diabetic. At best, I would say our chapters, there's 12, 15 AFTD ambassadors. For myself, I'm supposed to cover the whole state of California and part of Nevada. And this is 15 nationwide. And we only have a total of about 400 to 500 volunteers. We worry about small communities. You know, if you live in San Francisco or close to UCSF, you can go over there for the doctors. But if you're in a smaller area, one of our ambassadors is in Texas, and I forget what she said, in Eastern, small cities, small towns, and you're alone. There's no help. So the volunteers that we're doing is trying to reach out to and make a difference. And another reason why I do it, when I have done a meet and greet for the families and FTD patients, I'm here in Lincoln, I don't know if you know Sacramento, but he came down from Redding. And when I spoke with him first, he said when his wife was diagnosed with FTD, the doctors up there in Redding told him, well, you're just going to have to go it alone. He goes, where can I go for help? He goes, there's nothing up here, because it's a smaller town, not large like UC Davis. There's no big network. So he came down, And at the end, he says, Terry, when I came down here, I was so alone. But then he met other families. They exchanged emails and they formed a support group amongst themselves. So this is why I do it. It's just to help families and give them the support so they're not so alone. Because I remember that in the beginning. And if I had not had my sister-in-law who was going through the same thing, we would talk. We didn't know what we were going through, but we know how difficult it was for all of us. And then I think of some of these people out there alone and they need help. So get involved. The more volunteers we have, the bigger network, the more we can help other people and become an advocate for change. When they talk about, when they're going through the budget fundraising, what can get grants and not, be there to advocate for FTD. It does make a difference. So any questions now?
Gary, thank you. First off, I just want to thank you so much for this presentation. You got some love in the chat from some of our attendees today. One is sending you a hug. And I just want to thank you so much for offering this wealth of information alongside your personal experience with FTD. And I also want to acknowledge how instrumental your family has been in the research around FTD, given its prevalence within your husband's family. So I just want to thank you again for today, for your honesty, your wealth of knowledge and experience, and for all that you do to promote awareness of this disease. We did have some questions in the chat, and I'm just going to read them kind of in order in which they came in. So the first question had to do with hallucinations. That question, I actually found some information I'm going to drop in the chat. Teresa, you were right. Hallucinations are generally less common in FTD than they are in other types of dementia. It's more language and behavioral issues in FTD. So I wanted to acknowledge that first. One individual asked, are there speech problems in FTD linked to motor disorders?
And the answer is yes. Stephen's his speech became very slurry and really could not understand. The muscles in their neck do become very weak. So at one point we were feeding him liquids. He could not eat, but yes, speech becomes very much an issue. In fact, he probably quit speaking in about 2005, or just did minimal. Very much part of the ALS. And when we go back in family history, Stephen's grandmother, when we were talking to Dr. Bruce Miller, who's very much one of the leading in the country or nation or the world on FTD and ALS, she died from choking on a peach. And he said that was probably some of the first symptoms of the ALS. And so, because we thought, okay, we don't see it there, but they said it was probably there. So speech is very much a part of it.
Thank you.
It's unfortunate. Yeah, friends quit calling him, his best friend that lived in Oregon, because he says, I couldn't understand him.
Yeah.
I said, I'm thinking, well, you could just talk to him. But anyways, it is, yeah. The answer is yes.
Thank you for that. Another question that came in, what are medications available now that are being used to treat FTD, or at least the symptoms associated with FTD?
That I cannot give you a list. There's no medications to control or to help FTD. At best, if they're showing very anxious, they'll give him something for anxiety. I'm not into those kind of drugs. I'm not familiar with them. But if you need a question, you can go back to the AFTD, and they, I think, have a list of stuff that some doctors do give, or you could talk to your doctor about them. But it's more just to control if they have outbursts of crying or outbursts of anger, stuff to control some of the symptoms. But as far as a treatment for the disease, there's nothing, just symptoms.
Thank you for that. I want to acknowledge that, Teresa, again, you're getting more thank yous in the chat from people. Thank yous for sharing your story. Thank yous for answers to the questions. We have a few more questions and then we'll finish for the day.
Okay.
How long can the disease last? And does it, since it starts, in younger individuals, can a person who's diagnosed or his or her caregiver expect to be caregiving for a really long time?
The average age, the average time is probably 3 to 5 years.
Wow.
But they can live up to 20 years. It just depends how fast and what type they probably have. But I would say 10 years is the longest. I really believe when I look back on some of the things, when Stephen said he couldn't go to work because it was too hot that day, I thought, well, that's kind of weird. But, you're so busy keeping the family together, you don't think about it. But he probably started 40s, 45, 46, 47, and he passed away at 57.
Wow.
But his had the ALS, and he got pneumonia, and that's really what took him down for the last year and a half. He was on a ventilator, respirator, fed, and couldn't move from the neck down. So some ways I think I was more blessed because I didn't deal with some of the personality and some of what family had to, because he couldn't move around because of the ALS. I don't know if that was a blessing or not. It was, blessing in that sense, but also it gave it another own set of problems of taking care of him physically. But then it made some of the other parts of them taking off or just being difficult. He couldn't do it because of the ALS.
Thank you for that.
That answers anybody's question.
No, it is helpful. And we also had someone share in chat that her husband was diagnosed about 10 years ago. So it seems that it varies from person to person, and depending upon the progression of ALS, if that's present as well.
What variant they have too, it can make a difference. Someplace here when they were putting out, comes from the AFTD, and they said life expectancy is 7 to 13 years after the start of symptoms, but a lot of times still today. And I think that's what frustrates me so much. Okay, back in 2002, late 90s, FTD was not even heard of or being talked about. But today it still takes 2 to 3 years average to get a diagnosis. So a lot of times, is it from when the symptoms start? And in retrospect, we can look back and see maybe when they started or when they get a diagnosis. So I could say maybe 7 years from the time they get diagnosed, 13 years from when symptoms might have started. And some of them are so subtle. You think it's a midlife crisis, especially with anyone in their mid-40s, or you hear about midlife crisis, and it is there. So you put it off to other things. So yeah, but 7 to 13 years
is the average. But I appreciate that context that you give us, Terry, because it's more complicated. Like you said, this can look like you just said a midlife crisis.
Or laid off from a 25-year job that you loved and went into depression. Okay, So, you know, some of the stuff he started doing, you just think of that instead of FTD. Well, then in the 90s, you not even heard of the disease. So,
well, I want to conclude today by just sharing more love and appreciation in the chat from our participants. You know, one individual said after 10 years, she's learned so much from this presentation. She wanted to thank you. Another says that, you know, your candor and your personal experiences are very much appreciated. So I just want to acknowledge that the thanks coming in. We are over time. So if you do have any questions remaining, please respond to the follow-up email that you receive after this presentation, and I will direct any questions that you have to Terry. So hold on to them. If there's anybody who still has a burning question, make sure you respond to that follow-up email. But I do want to honor people's time because we are a little over today. Thank you so much for being here.
And can I just say one other thing?
Of course.
I'm very brief. I just want to thank people for tuning in today. I am not a professional, but I do have a passion, and I'm trying to, you know, be able to present so people know, because I understand how hard this journey is. And if anybody, like you said, do have any questions, they can give them to you and you can forward them to me.
Perfect.
And I can help them or get them connected to anybody that can help, because that is part of what not just my mission, but my personal, just because I know how alone it can be. It's a very isolating disease.
Thank you so much, Terry. You don't know how much you're appreciated, and you could have fooled us in terms of, you know, being a professional. You have a lot of expertise and a lot to offer in this field. So we thank you for your time today. Thank you, everyone, for attending. At the end, as you exit, you'll see a feedback survey. Please take a minute to fill it out. It shouldn't take more than a minute to complete, and it helps us get your perspective on programming like today's, and it's very helpful for planning purposes. So please take a moment to fill that out. Have a good rest of your day, and you will all receive a follow-up email with a link to the recording. All right. Thank you again, Terry.
And thank you for allowing me this opportunity.
Of course, it's our pleasure. On behalf of Oro Caregiver Resource Center, we're so excited that we could partner with AFTD and bring Terry's wisdom to the community today. With
Thank
that,
you.
You're welcome. Have a great day, everybody. Take care.
Okay. Bye-bye.